And let's take a look at the first opening passage. If you're with me in the Art Scroll Stone Chumash, it's on page 774, whatever Chumash you're using. It's Parshas Beha'alotecha, which is Bamidbar Perek Ches, chapter 8. So the Parasha begins, Vaydaber Adonai el Moshe lemor, Daber el Aharon, speak to Aaron. This is not one of the occasions where Hashem tells Moshe, speak to the children of Israel or the entire congregation, but this is a message specifically for Aaron. Daber el Aaron v'amarta elav, and say to him, Beha'alotecha es haneros, when you cause the lights or the lamps to ascend, El Mul Pnei Hamra Yerushevas Haneros. Now, the interesting thing is that this instruction already appeared in its more natural location, which is where the Torah instructs regarding the construction of the Mishkan and its appurtenances, which we had already in Parshas Truma. And then in Parshas Tetzaveh, we have more of the functionality of the Mishkan, including the instructions about the type of oil, that it should be pure olive oil, and it should be for the purpose of causing the light or the lamps to spring up continuously. A very similar passage to what we have here. And possibly for this reason, Rashi is alert to the fact that we've just, in last week's Parsha, had, I think, possibly the longest chapter in the entire Torah. Not that the chapters are really of Jewish origins, but nevertheless, it is an extended narrative, or an extended and repetitive account of how the 12 tribes, the 12 princes of the 12 tribes, brought a certain offering. If you turn back one page, if you're with me in the stone, it's on page 772. You have a chapter extending over 89 verses, which repeats 12 times the offering of each of the Nisim, and then it summarizes the sort of totals of the animals and the other offerings that they brought. It's a very curious extended narrative because of its repetitive nature. So Rashi says that that Moshe already oversaw the inauguration of the Mishkan. He oversaw even the role of the 12 Nisim in the course of 12 days, day by day, the offerings that each one of them brought. And in that way, each of the tribes, or the princes of each tribe, had a 15 minutes of fame, as I forget who was coined that expression at the moment. And so it was day by day. Says Rashi that Aharon saw all of the pomp and circumstance. He saw all of the drama. He saw the attention that was focused on each of the Nisim day by day. And says Rashi, Lama nisbechar Parshas HaMenorah Parshas HaNisim. Why is the portion of the menorah, which we're reading right now, juxtaposed to that of the Nisim? When Aharon saw the celebration of the inauguration through the hands, through the agency, through the contributions and the pomp and circumstances of each of the princes of the tribes, Chalsha az da'ato, shelo haya imahem b'Chanukah lo hu v'lo shivto, that neither he nor his tribe had a role in all of that drama, all of that pomp and circumstance. So Hashem said to Aaron, don't worry, Shilcha Gedola Mishalahem, your role is greater than theirs because you are responsible for the lighting and the maintenance of the menorah. Now, this comment of Rashi is very curious, and we'll return to that shortly. I just wanted to set the stage in terms of the juxtaposition, which haTurim also draws attention to. And haTurim has a slightly different angle, although, as we'll see, he probably is alluding to Rashi's comments and more as well. But let's consider what haTurim says. He says, Samach Neros leChanukah. The Torah juxtaposes the mitzvah of lighting the menorah to the Chanukah, that is to say, the inauguration of the Mishkan through the hands of the 12 Nesiim. Remez the Chanukah ledoros uprisume nisa. This alludes to the future Chanukah, the Chanukah that we celebrate every year, the Chanukah that recalls the miracle of the rededication of the Beis Hamikdash after it was defiled and trashed by the Assyrian Greeks. And therefore, just as the festival of Hanukkah is celebrated and is marked primarily by lighting the menorah. So in a similar way, when the Torah contains the instruction to Aaron to light the menorah, it's juxtaposed immediately to the Nisim. So that's what Baal HaTurim says in a kind of brief comment. Remes de prusume nisa v'neros. Probably what he means is that the sages could have expressed or could have legislated any number of different ways to remember and to celebrate and to recall the miracle of the rededication of the Beis Hamikdash. They chose to do so through commemorating and through immortalizing the miracle of the lights of the menorah with the oil. This is very well known. And says the Baal HaTurim, a remez to that is found here, in which the extended passage about the inauguration of the Mishkan through the Nisim is mentioned immediately before, and then we have Aaron lighting the menorah. What the Baal HaTurim doesn't say here in this short passage, but he elaborates on much further in his commentary al HaTorah, known as Tur al HaTorah. I've mentioned a few times, what we call Baal HaTurim is a series of fairly brief comments, often drawing on the juxtaposition or the appearance of a word in this location and in another location, often Roshei Tevos, very frequently Gematria. And those short comments of the what we call Baal HaTurim were part of a longer Perush that he wrote and that he, so to speak, published. That was before the printing press was available, and I suppose he put it out into the public domain, and it was recopied by scribes from time to time. But when the printing press was invented, and probably even before that, the short comments of the Tur, which became known as Baal HaTurim, were popular and probably circulating in manuscript and then circulating in and then printed together with other Perushim as well for hundreds of years, literally before the extended commentary of the Baal HaTurim was ever published, which was only published about 500 years later, literally about more than 500 years after the Baal HaTurim first wrote his commentary. So again, the short notes, which we call Baal HaTurim, which is my friend for the year, are short notes that are part of a longer commentary called, it's known nowadays as Tur al HaTorah. Actually, I did Tur al HaTorah as my friend for the year, maybe 10, 15 years ago. And probably the reason it was never reprinted for a long time, until, as I say, 500 years later in the early 1800s, is that it doesn't have an enormous amount of novel material. There is some, but much of it is based on Ramban. So Baal HaTurim, in his short comments here, is probably alluding to what he writes in the so-called Tur al HaTorah, in his more extensive Perush on the Torah, in which he tells us about Ramban. So let me share with you what Ramban says. So we mentioned already Rashi. Rashi says that the reason it's juxtaposed is that Aaron was feeling down. Aaron was feeling kind of left out or marginalized. That's what Rashi says. So Hashem told Moshe, tell Aharon, you shouldn't feel left out. You shouldn't suffer from what they call nowadays FOMO, fear of missing out, because on the contrary, you've got an important role which no one else has, and that is lighting the menorah. Says Ramban, this requires a lot of explanation, because interestingly, lighting the menorah is ksher bazar. It's one of the things, actually Ramban doesn't say this, that the Rambam says, that lighting menorah is actually not unique to Aaron, and it's not unique to the Kohanim themselves. It can be done in principle by a non-Kohen as well. It's just that the location of the menorah meant that only a Kohen is allowed to enter into that place. But says Ramban that this is completely mysterious. Aharon is the main personality in the whole inauguration. Aharon is the one who is going to offer the ketores. He's going to offer the daily sacrifice. He's going to offer all of the important karbonos day by day, and especially on Yom Kippur, the most important day. Aharon is the one upon whom rides the kapara, the atonement of the whole nation year by year. Rashi says, Lo huva lo shivto, neither he nor his tribe, but the Leviim were the ones who were responsible for the entire Mishkan, for disassembling it, for reassembling it, for transporting it, for ensuring that it was maintained properly. And of course, Aharon himself and his sons and descendants after him, the Kohanim were the ones who were the central players in the whole Mishkan. The fact that the 12 Nisim from each tribe had an opportunity to inaugurate it, that was just their day in the sun. But Aharon and his descendants and his family were the primary figures, the essential actors in the whole Mishkan, in the whole functionality of the Mishkan. So it's very difficult as besides which was Aharon so vain that he couldn't share the limelight with the Nisim? As we said, Aharon and his sons inaugurated it day by day. Really, it was really Moshe for the 7 days of the trial run. And then Vahibiyom Hashmini, it was Aaron and his sons. That didn't end very well because of the death of the sons of Aharon. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Aharon and his family were the central players. So the fact that afterwards, day by day, the 12 Nisim, each one had a chance to make a contribution and have his time in the limelight, was Aaron so unwilling to share the glory? It requires a lot of explanation. These are all the questions of Ramban, which the Tur, in his extended commentary on the Torah, quotes Ramban and summarizes Ramban. So Ramban says the answer lies in what I found, he says, in a certain Midrashic collection. It was an ancient manuscript, says Ramban, and that is that this is an allusion to the future Chanukah. The future Chanukah that will happen through the Chashmonaim, who are, or who were, the descendants of Aharon. So when Aharon was upset, Ramban means to say that I have such an important role. The Kohanim are so important in the Mishkan as long as the Mishkan lasts, and in the Beis Hamikdash as well, as long as it endures. But what happens after the Jewish people are driven into exile? What happens when the Mishkan and its successor is no more? What happens to the future destiny, the legacy of Aharon? What will become of it? Right now, and in the, let's say, immediate future, so Aharon has a very important role for the reasons that we've indicated. Moreover, the Kohanim are responsible for Tuma and Tahara, for all the tzaras, and for evaluating a mitzorah, whether it's of the body, of the garment, of the house, or the building. And the Kohanim are responsible for the purification of those who are defiled through contact with the dead, through the paraduma. The Kohanim in antiquity had a very important role, a crucial role. But what about beyond that? And this I heard from my Rosh Hashiva, who interpreted the Ramban to mean, what role will I have in the future, ultimate, eternal destiny of Klal Yisrael? What about in the many hundreds of years of exile, when the Beis Hamikdash is only a fond memory, and when the Kohanim and their descendants, that is to say, the descendants of Aaron, will be reduced to almost a symbolic role, to call someone first to the Torah? Okay, it's nice, there's some prestige attached to it, but it's a shadow of the role that the Torah has assigned to Aaron. And Pidyon Haben, there are some echoes still, but compared to the role of Aharon originally, so this way Chal Shadato, because maybe Aharon foresaw that all of this drama surrounding the Mishkan will last for a long time, but it won't last forever. I mean, in the future, we'll come back in the Zman HaMashiach. But what about the long night of exile? So that is why Aharon was appeased. And Hashem said to Moshe, tell Aaron, Beha'alos chayes haneros, when you cause the light to spring up. That is a remez to the future miracle that will be accomplished through the initiative, through the agency, through the faith, and through the leadership of the Bnei Chashmonaim, of the descendants of Aharon, who will be the actors in driving the Assyrian Greeks from the temple, from reinaugurating the temple. So now the Nisim had an important role, as we said, day by day. Hashem says to Aharon, you know what? You will have a role that will even transcend theirs, and for that matter, will transcend and will outlive the era in which you live now, because the Jewish people will remember that miracle and will cling to it and will relish it and will fulfill the mitzvah of menorah year by year, even long after the original menorah has been either lost or destroyed or carried into captivity. Maybe it's somewhere in the archives of the Vatican, as some have suggested, but we don't have that access to it any longer. But we do have the mitzvah of Ner Chanukah. So all of this is hinted to, according to the Baal HaTurim, in the juxtaposition of the Chanukah of the Nesiim, which alludes to the Chanukah of the descendants of Aharon, who are the Chashmonaim, and the Neros, the lights of the menorah, which Aharon will kindle. So even though it's true that the lighting of the menorah can be done by someone else, but it is the descendants of Aharon, the Chashmonaim, who will be responsible for the miracle of Hanukkah, which will always be recalled and which will always be celebrated, even in in the late date in Jewish history, even until this day. I don't just mean by those devout followers of Baal HaTurim who are with us tonight, but even those who are maybe even in the outer circle of Jewish practice and devotion. The mitzvah of Hanukkah still resonates with them. And on that note, I want to share with you a further comment of Baal HaTurim, where he says that Beha'alotecha es haneros. So our pasuk says Beha'alotecha es haneros, when you light, or literally when you cause to ascend the neros. Says about haTurim elsewhere in Parshas Tetzaveh, it says Laha'alos ner tamid. So the Baal HaTurim observes that here it says Beha'alotecha es haneros in the plural, and elsewhere in Parshas Tetzaveh it says Laha'alos ner tamid, ner in the singular. It says about haTurim, according to Beis, we have here a remes to the opinion of Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. This is one of the very famous disputes between the academies of Hillel and the academy of Shammai, between the academies of Hillel and Shammai, in which Beis Hillel maintains that the rhythm, or the sequence of lighting the menorah night by night, is to begin with one and to ascend upwards. So he says, according to Beis Hillel, Tchila ner v'achar kach neros. We start with ner in the singular and then we ascend. That's shemosifin v'holchin, that we add on, and that's laha'alos ner shemalin bakodesh. So the Baal HaTurim says in Parshas Tetzaveh, it says laha'alos ner tamid, but laha'alos implies to rise, to increase. So he says shema'alin bakodesh, we increase and we ascend in matters of sanctity. So therefore, in Parshas Tetzaveh it says laha'alos ner tamid in the singular, but in our parsha it says beha'aloscha es haneros in the plural, and that alludes to the opinion of Beis Shammai, that initially on the first night one candle, and subsequently another lamp and another lamp, laha'alos. But he says we're not done, because Beis Shammai wants to get into the game as well. So he says there is a remez also to the opinion of Beis Shammai. Tchila neros v'chakach ner. Initially neros in the plural, and subsequently the last night only a single ner, shemoridin v'holchin, and that is the remez laha'alos ner tamid. Sofei Tevos, the last letters of those three words, laha'alos ner tamid, is tered, taf resh dalet. Tered is to descend. So therefore, we have Baal HaTurim finds, by comparing the phrase here and the phrase in Tetzaveh, the way the Torah describes the process of lighting, here it's in the plural, there it's in the singular, to allude to the opinion of Beis Shammai that we start with multiple lights, 8, and we descend in the remes of Sofei Tevos Tered. Of course, Beis Hillel is of the view, on the contrary, laha'alos implies that we ascend. So we start with ner, Lahalos ner tamid in Parshas Tetzaveh in book of Shmos, and in our Sedra here, it says laha'alos, bahalos chas haneros, when you cause them to ascend. So this is a nice further remez in a halachic sense that the Baal HaTurim finds in the Torah Shabbat. He finds a remez in the Torah to the opinions in Torah Shabbat al Peh, in the oral Torah. Obviously, Hanukkah is not going to be legislated outright in the Torah because it's all in the post-biblical era, and certainly it's not going to be found in the written Torah. But Derech Remez, as we have seen, the Baal HaTurim finds a hint to it, and really Ramban already says that this is the meaning of the Medrash that Rashi quotes when he says Aaron was despondent or Aaron was demoralized because Aaron was concerned. All of this drama and all of the holiness and all of the proximity to God and the manifestation of the divine presence, which is with us now, it won't last. There will come a time when it will lapse. So Hashem, so to speak, consoled Aaron with the assurance that his descendants will be the primary movers in an event which will reverberate until the end of days, even in the darkness of exile, as we've seen. I want to share with you further thought about another famous passage in our Parsha, which can be found a few pages later on, and I'm referring to the words Vayhi bin Soa Ha'aron. And those words are famous not only because we have them in the Tefillah when we take out the Sefer Torah, Vayhi bin Soa Ha'aron, we sing it sometimes, but also because if you look on page 786 in the Stone Chumash, or whichever Chumash you are, at the last verses in chapter 10, and we see a feature which is unique to our Sedra, and that is the presence of those inverted or backward letters Nun. They're actually inverted and backwards. The letters Nun that appear within the blank space. And you probably know that this is not only an innovation of the printer, but rather this is found in the Sefer Torah itself. And that is something which is unique. It is a feature of the Masorah, of the tradition, the ancient tradition about the writing of the Sefer Torah. And much has been written about those backward letters. Now, I want to share with you in Baal HaTurim and elsewhere, I want to share with you one thought of Baal HaTurim about those letters Nun. So there is I'm sorry, I just need to make an emendation in my notes, which are not written with the same care as the Sefer Torah. I'm going to correct that. Yeah. So the Baal HaTurim observes in Pasuk Lamed Dalet, verse 34, Va'anan Adonai alehem yomam b'nas'am min ha'machaneh. The cloud of Hashem was upon them by day when they traveled from the camp, meaning when they broke camp in order to set out on their travels in accordance with the divine instruction. And this was before the unfortunate, tragic incident in next week's Sedra of dispatching the spies, before that disastrous tragedy. At this point, the Jewish people were on their way to the land of Israel. As I said, the fact that they were destined or condemned to wander in the desert for 38 more years still lie in the future. But nevertheless, they had to camp along the way. It wasn't like a stroll across town in order for them to get from the Sinai Peninsula, from Har Sinai, in order to reach the land of Israel, even if they had gone in a straightforward way. Besides which, they didn't know if they're supposed to go in a straightforward way or in a different way, for whatever the reason that the divine plan may intend. And that's what we have in those subsequent verses, Vayibin Saharon, V'Moshe, etc. But before we get there, we have to consider the significance of those reversed letters Nun. So Rashi says that those letters Nun, if you look in Rashi in Pasuk Lamed Hey, verse 35, V'Iben Sa Ha'aron, when the ark traveled, Asa lo simanim milfanav milacharav, that Hashem has stipulated, meaning the Masoretic tradition, the laws, the oral tradition as conveyed from early antiquity, from the giving of the Torah, was that there should be these two inverted letters Nun. Like those two verses are set off from the rest of the Torah. Lomar she'ein ze makom, that these two verses don't belong here, meaning they don't belong here according to the chronology. The correct position is here, but only because of a particular reason, and it wasn't really, the logic would not have naturally stipulated they belong here. We don't have time to discuss tonight. Beha'alotecha does mention where I might have thought they belong. It's actually found in Rabbeinu Bechai as well. But anyway, Rashi says, "Valama nichtav kan." Why is it written here? Kedei lahavsik ben Puranus to Puras. The famous comment of Rashi. The Gemara mentions it in Shabbos. Kedei lahavsik, in order to interrupt, in order to create a pause between misfortune and misfortune. Kedeisa b'kol kisvei kodesh, as it's written in a certain chapter in Masechta Shabbos. So the Meforshim wonder, what is the meaning of that statement? To set off that these two verses are mentioned here, are inserted here, so that we don't have the dismal, depressing reading of one misfortune followed by another misfortune. So it's set off by those two psukim, which are very nice psukim. Like I said, we recite them when we take out the Sefer Torah. We sing them, Vahi ben Saharon, etc. So those are nice psukim. We put them there, says Rashi, because if without them, we have misfortune and more misfortune, one after the other. So what is the misfortune after? That's quite clear. Take a look at the next pasuk. Vahi ham kimisonim rabas ne Hashem. The people began to seek complaints, and here we find the Torah goes on to describe it. They were complaining about the man. They were unhappy about it. They were complaining. Okay, that we can understand. Where is the misfortune before? So all of this is by way of essential introduction to what Beha'alotecha tells us. Vahi ben Saharon, what precedes it? Take a look. Vanan Hashem alehem yomam ben asam min hamachaneh. What's wrong with that? Not at all clear what's wrong with that. If you look at the previous pasuk, they traveled from the mountain of God a journey of 3 days, etc. What's wrong with that? The Mishkan would precede before them, or the ark would precede before them 3 days. We don't see any misfortune. So there's a famous comment of Tosfos based on a medrash, which we'll get to in a moment. But first I want to tell you what the Beha'alotecha says, because the Beha'alotecha also finds a remez to the misfortune. So Rashi explains that the reason those two psukim of verses 35 and 36 are offset in that manner is in order to indicate that they have been positioned here in an unexpected place, not because that is where they really belong, but we've put them here, or the Torah, Hashem has instructed that they are placed here in order to avoid the unhappy litany of misfortune and then further misfortune. So we pause by mentioning verses which are more upbeat, which are more hopeful, which are more conventional. The problem is we don't understand what is the misfortune that precedes. So here we have the Baal HaTurim says a very interesting comment, very, as is frequently the case, a subtle observation. Banas'am mikedem. It says here, Banas'am, take again a closer look at Pasuk Lamed Daled, Va'anan Hashem alehem yomam Banas'am min hamachane, when they traveled from the camp. So it says about haTurim, the word benas'am appears only one other place in all of Tanakh, and only appears benas'am when they traveled in one other place. Benas'am mikedem, when they traveled from the east. So where does that appear? You may recall that those words appear benas'am mikedem in the prelude to the tragedy of the Tower of Babel. When they traveled from the east. And Rashi there says they were in the east, Har HaKedem, because the descendants of Noah initially settled there, and then they traveled from the east. Where did they travel to? Well, they found a certain Bik'ah, they found a valley, and they built a tower, and that is the Tower of Babel. Says the Baal HaTurim, since the only other place of the word Benas'am appears is in the instance of the Tower of Babel, which was a great tragedy. It was almost an echo or a sequel to the sin of the generation of the flood. And then if we find generations later a further tragedy of Migdal Bavel, and therefore it was an example of mered, which is rebellion. So the Baal HaTurim says this hints that here also it was rebellion. What he's alluding to is what the Gemara, what Tosfos says, Ketinok haborech mi beis hasefer, because it says that they traveled 3 days mehar Hashem. Says the Tosfos, quoting the Medrash, like a child running away from school. He hears the school bell and he's out of there like a shot. The Medrash says the Jewish people were eager to leave the mountain of God. They thought if we hang around here any longer, he might give us more commandments. We've had enough. 613, that is enough. We don't want any more. We're out of here. So that was the misfortune. So Baal HaTurim finds a remiss to that as well. A remiss which is not written in the Torah, meaning the Medrash, Rashi says that there is misfortune that follows these two verses, which we can see, and there's misfortune which precedes it, and the Baal HaTurim says it's hinted to in Vahi ben Asamikan. Now, Baal HaTurim does not say, but I think he's alluding to another case where it says Mikedem. Vahi, it says Vayisa Mikedem, and that is speaking in Parshas Lech Lecha, in the example of Lot, who left the east and he traveled towards Sodom. And even though the geography is not so clear how that can work out, but Rashi says, Hisia atzmo mikadmuso shel olam. He repositioned himself away from the origin of the world. It means from God himself. The company of Avraham was to be in the proximity of the divine revelation, and Lot didn't want that. So he distanced himself from Avram, he was at that time, and he made his way to Sodom. So I think the Baal HaTurim is alluding to that when it says Mikedem. Benas'am, it says here, and only there in the case of the Tower of Babel. But Mikedem, which it says in the case of Migdal Bavel, Benas'am Mikedem, I think alludes to Lot, who left Mikedem, and there Rashi says Mikadmusu Shel Olam. B'Kitzur says that we see here in the Baal HaTurim in brief that Benas'am hints that they were traveling away from Hashem, and probably he has in mind also, like we said, Ketinok haborech mi beis hasefer, because Vayisume har Hashem, of course, the mountain of God definitely symbolized the divine revelation and the communication and the proximity and the awareness of the presence of Hashem in their lives. They left there, according to what the Medrash says, like a child fleeing from school because they thought if we hang around here, this mountain anymore, we might get more mitzvahs. This is indeed a misfortune. I mean, not that we find evidence that I'm aware of that Hashem intended to give them more than Targum mitzvahs. Targum mitzvahs is the right number. There's no basis to say that really there should be more than Taryag mitzvahs. But the Jewish people in their own mind, they didn't want to even allow for such a possibility. Therefore, they fled. And this is a paranios, which is the misfortune to which the pasuk here alludes. So stop here already and over time already. Thank you to everyone, and I wish you a wonderful Shabbos.